Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. My name is Pascal Alate. I'm the director with the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health. A very warm welcome from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where it's currently 9:11 a.m. on Monday, the 12th of July. And a happy birthday to anyone who has a birthday today. We're living in a time when we are overwhelmed with information, but at the same time underwhelmed with the tools that help us to determine how to synthesize it all and draw out the truths that enable us to be effective global health researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. The same statistic or data point can be interpreted in multiple ways when placed within a range of different contexts. We need to have ways of holding these different bits of information together for our own synthesis and understanding and be able to convey information to others. It is therefore my absolute delight to hand you over to Professor Doe Mayer, an emeritus professor of the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. Doe is an award-winning documentary and fiction filmmaker, as well as a renowned researcher in the impact of storytelling in health research and policymaking. We're also incredibly privileged to have her with us at UNU-IIGH as a principal visiting fellow. She will tell you more about herself shortly, and I can assure you that you are in for an amazing workshop. Thank you for choosing to share your Sunday evening or Monday morning with us. And Doe, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Pascal, for that lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to start by thanking the other people beside Pascal who've been responsible for this, particularly Basilio Vadewesa, who has been my partner throughout and been tremendously helpful in making this work. Basilio, do you want to say anything about yourself other than that you're the program manager for this program?
Just wanted to send my thanks to Doe. Thank you for the introduction. I am Basilio Valdewesa, and I'm the Knowledge Management and Communications Manager at UNU-IIGH. And we've prepared a very good program for you today, so we look forward to hosting you and look forward to your participation. Thank you.
The other person two other people I want to thank, Mike Bakunis, the Research Fellow and Capacity Builder for Local Decision Making with the UN there in Malaysia. I don't think he's going to be on the screen at the moment, but he's been terrific at helping us. And my colleague and friend, Nina Kleinberg, who's helping with technical support and has given us terrific feedback on this process. So thank you, Nina, and thank you, everybody. And I'm looking forward to what we're about to do. And I think we're going to start with my giving you some what I would call stage directions. So if possible, it would be great if you watch the Zoom meeting in speaker view and side by side. As most of you have probably been through many, many Zooms, certainly I have in the last year and a half. Mute your microphone unless you want to speak and we recognize you. And we're hoping that you'll stay with us live the whole time and not put your picture on and leave. I really want this to be an interactive workshop, and I think that works much better if as many of you as can stay with us and stay engaged with us. So please stay with us the whole time. I think you'll be glad you did. I certainly hope so. Okay, let me tell you a little about me, or I'm just going to actually tell you a little story about me. I met Pascal a couple of years ago in Los Angeles, and we were at a party. We were having a lovely time, and she asked me what I did, and I explained to her that for many years I've been working in health communication, largely in the context of storytelling and a whole field called entertainment education. How do we make health information more accessible and more compelling to the different audiences we're trying to reach? She was really interested in that. And she told me who she was and what she did and who she worked with. And I said to her, you know, the kind of work I do is really about who is the audience and what would convince them to think differently or change their minds about something. And maybe you don't need me. You don't need the kinds of things that I would talk about because you're dealing with people who understand data, who work with data all their lives, who are really far more educated and knowledgeable than a general public, and maybe they don't need this kind of storytelling. And she looked at me and she said, "You have to be kidding." She said, "I have done this all over the world. I've given lectures in many places. I've watched many others give lectures in many places. And every time when I look up at a live audience, people are sleeping, people are doing other things on their computers, people are chatting, they're not listening, they're not watching all the data they're getting. They get as bored with it as some of the rest of the audiences that we try to reach. And I think storytelling would be a great asset to anyone in this area." And of course, I was delighted to hear her say that and invite me to run this particular workshop. So thank you, Pascal. And I hope you'll all find this subject as interesting and compelling as I do. And I hope you'll ask questions as we go along, and let me know what you think and your responses to things. Okay, so I'm going to start with somebody who you may or may not know, Jimmy Kimmel. We're going to have a slide of him shortly. There she is with the slides. Jimmy Kimmel is a very famous, popular late night television host and a comedian in the US. He's extremely well known, and he runs a night show that he's been running for many, many years. And in 2017, in the middle of the fight for the Affordable Care Act in the United States, and I'll go into that a little more after we hear the short video clip from him, he gave us a story that was really important to how we saw the Affordable Care Act, what is also called Obamacare, and now you'll see it for yourselves.
A story to tell about something that happened to our family last week. I'm sorry, I try not to get emotional, but it was a scary story. And before I go into it, I want you to know it has a happy ending, okay? So when I'm telling this, don't get too upset. Leave that to me. But a little over a week ago on Friday, April 21st, my wife, Molly, gave birth to a boy, a baby boy. His name is William John Kimmel. Thank you very much. We call him Billy. It was an easy delivery, 6 pushes, he was out, and he appeared to be a normal, healthy baby until about 3 hours after he was born. We were out of the delivery room. We moved to the recovery room. Our whole family was there, and we introduced him to his 2.5-year-old sister. She was cute with him. We were happy. Everything was good. My wife was in bed relaxing, and when a very attentive nurse at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, her name is Nanush, was checking him out and heard a murmur in his heart, which is common with newborn babies, but she also noticed he was a bit purple, which is not common. So she asked me to come with her, and my wife and I assumed it would be nothing. Our daughter had a heart murmur too, and we didn't notice that he wasn't the color he was supposed to be. So I accompanied Billy and the nurse, went down the hall to another part of the hospital, the neonatal ICU, where another excellent nurse named Ann checked him out and called the doctor in. And now all of a sudden it felt serious. And the room started to fill up. More doctors and nurses and equipment started coming in. And they determined he wasn't getting enough oxygen into his blood, which, as far as I understand, or understood at the time, was most likely one of two things, either his heart or his lungs. And you hope it's the lungs because sometimes they have fluid in them after delivery, and it's potentially a minor thing. But they did an x-ray, and his lungs were fine, which meant his heart wasn't. So now more doctors and nurses and equipment come in, and it's a terrifying thing. You know, my wife is back in the recovery room. She has no idea what's going on. And I'm standing in the middle of a lot of very worried-looking people, kind of like right now, who are trying to figure out what the problem is. And it's Friday night, and so they call a pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Eben Zahn, who, when they called him, was picking his mother up from the airport. Luckily, her plane was not delayed because he got to the hospital very quickly. They did an echocardiogram, which is a sonogram of the heart, and found that Billy was born with a heart disease, something called tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. It's hard to explain. Basically, the pulmonary valve was completely blocked, and he has a hole in the wall between the left and right sides of his heart. And then they brought my wife in, and they wheeled her in, and Dr. Zahn told her what was going on and what our options were. And we decided to take him to Children's Hospital, where there's a world-renowned cardiac surgeon who is, by all accounts, a genius. His name is Dr. Von Starnes. So we put the baby in an ambulance to Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and on Monday morning, Dr. Starnes opened his chest and fixed one of the 2 defects in his heart. He went in there with a scalpel and did some kind of magic that I couldn't even begin to explain. He opened the valve, and the operation was a success. It was the longest 3 hours of my life, but it was a success. So, they didn't do everything. He'll have to have another open heart surgery in 3 to 6 months to close those holes, but they want to wait until he's bigger, and then he'll have a third, hopefully non-invasive procedure sometime maybe in his early teens to replace the valve he has now. So this poor kid, this is what he looked like on Monday. But this is what he looked like yesterday. And I want to say one other thing. We were brought up to believe that we live in the greatest country in the world, but until a few years ago, millions and millions of us had no access to health insurance at all. You know, before 2014, if you were born with congenital heart disease like my son was, there was a good chance you'd never be able to get health insurance because you had a pre-existing condition. You were born with a pre-existing condition, and if your parents didn't have medical insurance, you might not live long enough to even get denied because of a pre-existing condition. If your baby is going to die, and it doesn't have to, it shouldn't matter how much money you make. I think that's something that, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else, we all agree on that, right? I mean, we do. And I think whatever your party, whatever you believe, whatever you support, we need to make sure that the people who are supposed to represent us, the people who are meeting about this right now in Washington, understand that very clearly. Let's stop with the nonsense. This isn't football. There are no teams. We are the team. It's the United States. Don't let their partisan squabbles divide us on something every decent person wants. We need to take care of each other. I saw a lot of families there, and no parent should ever have to decide if they can afford to save their child's life. It just shouldn't happen. Not here. So, anyway, thank you for listening. I promise I'm not going to cry for the rest of the show.
Okay, so to me, still a very touching storytelling moment when Kimmel talks about this little child that he's just had that almost died but was saved by a decent medical system here in the United States. I would like to point out, I don't think everything is so great in the United States, but this particular storytelling that he did in 2017 really had a huge effect on American society. It's called Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. You may have heard of it. It was a law that improved access for health insurance to all Americans, obviously exactly what Kimmel's talking about here. Republicans, who were the major party in Congress in 2017, had been against Obamacare and supported President Trump's effort to destroy it at the time. But Kimmel's story caused huge public outcry to support and keep Obamacare, to allow some system to be in place that would allow parents to get help for sick children. And ultimately, the Republican opposition for this just collapsed under the huge social pressure of Americans calling and talking about this and media talking about this. And to this day, 2021, Trump is no longer in office. ACA is still the law of the land, and we certainly hope that it will continue to be for some time to come. So this obviously isn't just because of Kimmel's video. It's never one story or one thing that makes change in a society. But this had tremendous effect, and the social scientists looked at it as one of a number of components of the change that's possible, and really realized that it was an important factor in terms of research and the data collected about attitudes and this huge change that happened in Congress with policymakers at least in part because of this compelling story. Now, stories can also be dangerous. They can be used to give bad information. I'm sure we all have some experience of bad information in stories. They can distort the evidence and scare and frighten people. Demagogues do this all the time, generating fear and anger in their audiences by claiming that their opponents are evil and dangerous. I imagine that many of you have direct knowledge of this kind of a situation where stories are used for bad things to happen. And I never want to be accused of saying that stories can only be good, but stories can be a force for good. And I think it's really important to consider this as we continue with the workshop. So let's go on to the objectives for this workshop, what we're trying to do here. The first one is to improve oral and written skills for storytelling for anyone who wants to share health information with anyone, gatekeepers, policymakers, or other professionals. I want to point out, as I will get into more later, that different audiences need different messaging and different stories. We're not all the same on this, but it's important to both use our oral skills and our written skills to try to convince policymakers of, particularly in terms of health information, what they can do to make change. Objective 2, to design storytelling strategies for more effective communication, whether for public policies and also for individual behavior change. I imagine that most of you work in both areas, in areas that include the importance of talking to people. Pascal was, I think, terrific at sort of explaining that there are so many times when health experts are talking both to public and to individuals, and the importance of stories is so critical in this context. And the third objective for the workshop is going to show up in a minute. It's to learn the neuroscience of storytelling, to begin to be aware, and I imagine many of you are, that the brain is designed to remember and process information better through stories than through lists of data. We've had years now with MRI machines that can actually measure what's happening in the brain when we hear stories, when we get data, and we have really good science evidence now, not just sort of creative people with their ideas, but also terrific scientists pointing out that stories are a stronger way to affect people emotionally and make change. So for all those reasons, I'm hoping that when you come out of this workshop, you'll have a little bit of a deeper understanding. I imagine you have some now of these particular issues and how they work. Okay, let's go to the next slide. My request to you, and it's probably clear now, is please participate, ask questions, raise your hand or wave. If you don't understand something, tell me. I will try to respond to you all. I have some help to do that, but I really would like this to be exchange and not just a lecture. And the only way to do that is to get you to participate. So please feel free at any point to ask questions. And as soon as I can, either Nina or I will reach you and try to find out what you're interested in, what your concerns are, what you agree with, and maybe what you don't agree with. That's fine too. Okay, let's go on and talk about some of the elements of stories. Now, like everything in this lecture, you're going to find that there are many different points of view about what are elements of stories. None of this is mathematical. All of this is still sort of based in different people's ideas of what a story is and how it works. And these are some of what I think are the important components from my point of view for storytelling. One is that you have a strong character, at least one, maybe more. But you've got to have somebody or someone who does something. Passive characters are very hard for us to respond to. Active characters who are engaged are much more interesting and much more compelling, and we identify with them in a different way. The second element here is setting. What do I see in the words or pictures? How do I see the place where the story is being told? It could be a different era of time. It could be an urban area. It could be a rural area. It could be inside a home or outside a home. The details of setting are really important in helping an audience into your story. In filmmaking, we call it, what do we call it? We call it leaning in. What makes me lean into the story? Well, words, pictures, images, visceral responses to things, and setting is a key piece of that. When there's no setting, it's hard for me to envision the story. Trouble. I like trouble. Other words are obstacles and problems. You're going to see that in a lot of the lecture here. But trouble is critical to a story. You can't tell a story where everything works and everyone is fine. That's not a story. It's not of interest unless somebody is in some kind of a problem. They don't always have to be dying or in physical danger, but there has to be some kind of a problem that's meaningful to the characters in order to make this work for a story. So you've got to think about what are the obstacles and problems. I think sometimes in my work with nonprofits, their response is, we don't want to spend a lot of time on the trouble. We want to spend time on us and the solution. I'm thinking particularly of stories that are helpful in fundraising for different kinds of nonprofit organizations that work in health. And very often they will tell a story in writing and in sending letters or something out to ask for money or speaking, which is basically, there was a problem in society, like COVID. There was a problem with COVID. We didn't know what to do about it. Our organization came in and contributed to getting more people vaccinated. We've done a great job. Give us money so we can do better. That's not a story. There's nothing, you don't tie in much to the idea of what happens with COVID. Matter of fact, you tie in hardly at all. Your interest, the interest of the people who are trying to raise money is generally how good the organization is, what a great job they did. But that doesn't work unless there are problems and unless you really go into what the problems are. So I'm going to encourage you to think in detail about obstacles and problems because they're so important to an audience in understanding a story. Plot, again, something has to happen. Stories have to move. You're seeing this in a number of these components. The character has to change. Something has to happen to the character. Something has to happen in the story as well. And that has to have some causality. I'll be going into this a little bit later. Something happens because something else happened. When things just come in out of the blue, we don't quite know how to respond to that or where to take it. Point of view. How do I want the audience to feel and think about the story? If I don't know how to think about the story, how do you think I respond? How would I respond? Generally bored, not interested. Why did I have to hear this if I don't understand why you're telling me the story? That's as true of a joke as it is about a story, but I think we really want to think about what our point of view is. That can be called theme. It can be called the major moral of the story, but I actually like point of view better because I think it's a little more sophisticated than some of the more common approaches of scolding people and telling them what to do and then being surprised when they don't do it. And then another element that's always important is resolution. Something has to happen at the ending or people get frustrated or confused or just turn off to the story again because they don't know why you've told it to them. So you've got to give them some resolution. It doesn't have to be a happy resolution. All stories don't have happy resolutions, but it needs to have some ending and make people feel comfortable that with this information you've given them so far, they can understand the situation, they can understand the story, they could tell it to someone else, and they feel emotionally compelled to do that. So anyone have any other ideas for the elements of a story? Anyone want to participate here and tell us? Does a call to action count as I can't read the rest of this. A call to action is very important in storytelling, and it's a great point you're making. I don't know that it's necessarily a specific element, but certainly in the kinds of stories that we often tell in health, the idea of a call to action, what am I supposed to do as a result of hearing this story, is a critical piece of the message of the story. Am I supposed to go to the doctor? Am I supposed to change my behavior? Am I supposed to write to a policymaker and tell them how I feel? So the call to action can be a critical component of story, but everything, again, doesn't have all those components. I think that's it. There are other pieces of this. Some people would say symbolism is an important part of a story. Of course, it can be, but maybe it isn't. Morals are an important part of the story. They can be. Certainly some moral or ethical path is generally told in a good story, but of course, as I've already said, it can happen in a bad story too. Okay, let's go on to story definitions. And I'll ask you for 1 minute to write your own definition of a story on a piece of paper or on your computer or something. What do you think a definition of a story is? What is it? No easy answer. There's no formula. If you have a good idea, let us know. I'll give you about 30 seconds here to write your definition. Okay, if anyone wants to share their definition, please do so in the chat or tell us and we'll call on you to share your definition of a story. I don't see anyone, but is anyone interested in sharing their definition?
Yeah, hi, Doe.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Vijay. I feel like story is something like it's the convincing kind of message.
Mm-hmm. It certainly helps if it has a convincing message, but you know, some stories are just entertaining. They're just sort of fun to hear. But even then, you know, as you're saying, they have to have something about them that makes us feel that they're compelling. And exactly what that is part of the storyteller's skill in doing this. Anyone else want to share a definition or a thought about what a story could be? I'm going to give you a bunch of definitions. I won't leave you sort of floating about with this, but it's interesting to hear it. Does anyone else have a definition?
James has her hand raised.
I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry. Could you say
Sorry,
it again?
I put my hand up. I had an idea.
Okay.
You know, it's a little bit vague, I think, perhaps. It doesn't contain a lot of the words that you've just described. But I'm thinking that perhaps a story is a narrative that takes you on a mental journey. You know, I suppose it's a series of actions that your mind can follow along to that are strung together in a certain way, such that each event is connected. That's what I think of as a story.
I think that's a great definition. And I think the idea that the points are connected, the events are connected is critical to any good story. I think that's an excellent point. And you do have to be able to follow it in some way. You know, what happens when you can't follow the story, Oria? What happens when you get confused? What happens to you as a viewer or a reader?
I suppose you disconnect. You either struggle to continue listening or you put up a mental block and your mind goes elsewhere. Right,
or you walk away. Something like that. Okay, terrific. Anyone else got a definition?
Hi, Doe. It's Basilio here. I wanted to call on Reem Ghaffar, who raised her hand earlier, to give a definition.
I raised my hand and then I put it down again when I heard Aria's definition.
Please don't feel shy.
You have something else you want to tell us? Don't be shy. There's no answer to this. It's not a simple question with a simple answer. Uday had a hand up as well. I'm getting a message, which is fine.
Yeah, I thought a story would basically describe a character's journey, because we look at, my understanding of the story is the growth of the character, you know, from the beginning to the end, and how they overcome. And Oria raised a great point about how things should be connected and should flow, of course, to keep, you know, the reader engaged. That's what I had.
Good. No, I think that's terrific. I'm going to jump in and give you some of the official definitions of story. I don't think they're as satisfying as your definitions, to be honest, but I'll give
Doe,
you.
Sorry to interrupt, Doe. Just wanted to hear from one more person, Kairu Raf, who has his hand up.
Okay, great. Please speak up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I think stories are facts that with
Can you speak a little
creativity.
louder, please? You think stories are what?
Story is a fact. It's like facts that with creativity in creating impactful effect on the listener. I think that's how from the ancient oral tradition of story, they're actually trying to give fact, but in a way that it can leave a very long long impact on the listener itself.
I think that's an excellent point and very true. And as you point out, it's the history of humankind to tell stories and to use stories as a way to understand the world and see things differently. So very, very important point and very universal, not specific. I mean, how we tell stories may be very different in different cultures. We do, but the idea of storytelling as a major way to think about the world and see ourselves in the world, I think, is a critical piece of thinking about this. Okay, I want to go on to some of the dictionary definitions of stories, which I must say I don't think are as good as yours, but let's look at some of them. Keep going. So the dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster, which is a well-known American dictionary, calls it an account of incidents or events. Some of you got it that in your own definitions, and certainly that's a piece of a puzzle, but I would argue not the whole puzzle. Dictionary.com calls it a narrative. Incidentally, I'm going to use, as it says at the top of the PowerPoint, story and narrative is the same thing, as synonymous. There are, in the field of study of this, some distinctions, but in the popular world I live in, they're used interchangeably. So we're going to use them interchangeably, and you already have in your definitions. So it's a narrative, either true or fictitious in prose or verse, designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the hearer or reader. Again, I think it gets at some of these ideas that you've mentioned in a different way, but I think it's somewhat limited and not entirely satisfying. Some other definitions that I've heard and that I think are well worth thinking about are something with a beginning, middle, and end is often a story. A tale made for entertainment. Stories are supposed to be entertaining. That doesn't mean that they make you laugh, but it means that they make you emotionally connect, or as I say, to lean forward into something. A piece of gossip. Gossip turns out to be a very important storytelling place, not always negative, although the word gossip sometimes sounds negative, but it's a way that we communicate about situations very often in more informal kinds of life that we find ourselves in. So gossip certainly can be a kind of a story. A joke can be a story. It's not always a story. Some jokes are sort of one-liners and little things, but some jokes are stories, and that's worth thinking about too. Again, not the only thing. And a lie is a story. In English, we say, you know, that little boy told a story, which means he lied about something. So all of those are appropriate definitions of the idea of story. It really is all over the place. I think the most important thing that you want to think about here is basically that stories have to have a structure. They have to have something that happens that causes something else to happen. Ian Forster, I like this definition, says if you say the king died and then the queen died, that's not a story. But if you say the king died and then the queen died of a broken heart, that's a story. There's causality there. There's a connection, as you pointed out yourselves, between the two parts of the issue. We understand the connection and we become interested in what broke her heart or what didn't break her heart or how she felt about what happened when the king died. So there has to be some causality in stories. But everything is not a story. Let's go to the next slide. This is my favorite definition, actually. And again, it doesn't cover all points. Go back to the next one, Nina, there. A better story definition, one that I like that was taught to me by my mentor, very simple, not a lot of words, not a lot of ideas. Someone wants something badly, but's having difficulty getting it. Frank Daniel was a famous film Hungarian teacher that I had when I was a lot younger and didn't have white hair. But that often essentially gets at this idea of something has to happen. Sometimes people aren't aware of what is happening. They may not quite know what they want, or what they want isn't what they think they want. But the idea that there's some obstacle and problem in getting it generally applies to many, many stories. Again, not all stories. Okay, let's continue. What is not a story? So lots of things are not a story. And I've made a list of them, and perhaps you have some more to add. That would be great. Menus are not a story. Databases are definitely not a story. I often wish that reports were more of a story than they are, but usually they are not a story, and they're often simply filled with data and facts and information. Instruction manuals, of course, are not a story. Catalogs, street signs, anecdotes. And the difference between anecdote and story is that an anecdote is just 2 or 3 things that happened, whereas a story has a structure and a meaning and all the other components we've always talked about. Anyone else have a good idea of what is not a story? Some people say everything is a story. I don't buy that. You can make it into a story, but it's not necessarily a story. Let's see, somebody, I don't see anything new about this. So I will continue. Next slide, please.
Maybe image.
Oh, sorry, someone's there. I couldn't see. Sorry, who?
Hi, this is Uday. Yeah, I mean, like, can we include the image as non-story?
The what? I'm sorry.
An image.
Photo
Oh,
image.
an image or a photo can be a story. That's a very important point. Paintings can be a story if there's enough causality in them to allow you to sort of think of them that way. But there's certainly certain photos that at least begin a story or come somewhere in this idea of linkage between one thing and another thing. I'm thinking of some of the great realistic paintings of earlier times. Most cultures have some version of stories that are in paintings or in other kinds of artwork. Certainly, we have stories, as you know, in theater and film and storytelling. But I think there's also plenty of times when a still picture does tell a story. Somehow we fill in that image with this component of change that makes it a story. Excellent point. Okay, let me go on to some of the structures of story. A very conventional structure is a 3-act structure. Some people would say it's the beginning, middle, and end, which is basically what the 3-act structure is. It can be short, it can be a long film or piece of theater, sometimes theater of 5 acts. Again, none of these are rules, but they're simply ideas to help us think about this. What I think is important about the 3-act structure is that there is a beginning. Often it starts in a good situation. Nothing is happening and then something happens. Sometimes it starts with a strong situation, but even then it has to sort of go back down in terms of this line that goes up, which is generally considered sort of the line of tension. There has to be an incident. Again, you're getting different words for this. Inciting incident, second thoughts, climax of Act 1. You're seeing the line of tension going up. More obstacles, a word that I'm fine with. There's some point in Act 2 where something bigger happens, but this tension line keeps going up to the climax of the story, which is usually at the end of Act 2, as you can see here in the 3-act structure. And then there's a descending line of action. There's a descending line of tension as things are tied up, wrapped up, and then the ending or resolution. Does anyone have a question about this? Again, it's not a rule. It's simply one frame for understanding story structure. There are stories that are structured quite differently than this, and I'm going to give you one more example beside this one. Anyone got something they'd like to say about this? Okay, let's go on to the Campbell.
I see a hand from Reem Ghaffar.
Great, I can't see those hands, so that's great. Thank you. Reem?
Yeah, I just have a quick question about the resolution. Is sometimes not having a resolution a very bad thing? Because sometimes you know, the ending doesn't, there is no end or satisfying end to the story.
Right. No, that's true. Some resolutions are more satisfying than others. In the film school where I teach, we make a distinction between confusion and ambiguity. If the story ends in confusion, the audience usually responds, as we've already talked about, you know, as being bored or unsatisfied or uninterested. Sometimes ambiguity can allow a conversation. One of the interesting things about change in human behavior is it's often not the media that makes the change, but the media generates a conversation. You talk to your boyfriend, your partner, your mother, your neighbor, and in that conversation, you begin to think about the change you could make. And I like to argue that ambiguity can help do that. What do you think? Why did she do that at the end? You know, or even if you're dissatisfied with the end, that can be a very appropriate response. But it has to have some punctuation. If it doesn't, we just feel frustrated. But I think the frustration can still be a resolution, a clear resolution with a period at the end of the sentence. But it's a terrific question, and it's something we all wrestle with. If the story is too clear, sometimes I think it doesn't generate that conversation that might make a behavior change. Whereas if we're very emotionally engaged in it and we want to talk about it, that might help us make the change. Excellent question. Any others? Okay, let's go to the Campbell idea of structure. So Joseph Campbell, very, very famous professor of literature, mythology, and religion, wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's been used for years as framing for many kinds of stories, and especially for Hollywood movies. Campbell proposed the idea that myths from all over the world seem to be built from the same elementary ideas about story, which he articulated in the context of this hero's journey, the monomyth, as he called it. He gained a lot of recognition when George Lucas credited Campbell's work with influencing the structure of the Star Wars movies, which very much fit this particular outline that Campbell provides us with. It's split, as you can see, into two worlds. There's the ordinary world, and then there's the world of magic, the world of transformation. And it starts in the ordinary world where the hero is called to adventure. You might remember that in Luke Skywalker, and the idea of that he gets from Leia's message of what he needs to do. And then he says he can't do it, the refusal of the call. I'm not going to go through all the steps of this. This may be more complex than you need as a storyteller in health communication, but it's a very interesting concept. And as you look at it, I think what you'll also see is this idea that, again, there's different steps, there's different parts of it. One could call abyss at the end of the second act, the climax, something happens. There's a revelation, there's some big moment there. Then we end up going through other components of the magical world and the road back and the return to the normal world, but with some change. Something has changed. A character has changed, and something has changed in the situation. Some of the changes that you could think about. Actually, I think I'll just leave it at that for the moment, but basically this idea is in The Matrix. This idea is in The Lion King. There are an awful lot of American films, and not just American, it's really a very universal prototype of a person's journey and their change as a result of problems in their life. But in this case, obviously, you've got the ordinary world, and often you have this magic world with magic people helping you. Meeting the mentor is obviously a piece of the introduction into the magic of the new world. Anyone have a thought or question about this? Yes, somebody does. I see a hand. No?
Oh, sorry, I had a quick question.
Sure.
Unrelated specifically to what you've just said, but more so about these two story structures in general. I know with the hero's journey and kind of the 3-bit structure that we saw earlier, there's a lot of different components to it. These kind of, I suppose, like a series of components that lead to kind of a climax or to a top, and then it goes down. And I was wondering, do you think it's important that stories have multiple components like this? Or if you only had 30 seconds to say a story, are there 3 components that might be most important to hit on? Or should all stories try and, I suppose, hit all these different little aspects of a story structure?
No, I think, again, excellent point. No, all stories, particularly short jokes and stories that are small and take, a paragraph, can't do all this, can't get through all this. Again, it's not a formula. It's simply a framework for thinking about story. But no, I think a story can just have a beginning, middle, and end. Or a joke. Anyone got a good joke to tell us? Could have a beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't have to go through all these stages in order to be a good story. But it does have to have a structure. There has to be some structure to it. Otherwise, it just feels like an anecdote that doesn't pay off. But you can do that in something short. You can do that in something much longer and more extensive. The hero's journey really is something that I think you see mostly in film now, also in novels, of course, and components like that. But as we go through Cinderella, which I'll be talking about in a minute, I think you'll see a lot of these same components, not all, and not necessarily the same order, but the idea of magic, the idea of being in an ordinary world, going into something magical is certainly very common in all myths, and then possibly coming back to the ordinary world with a change, with knowing something different. But no, I don't think all stories need all these things, and indeed it's too much complexity for most of the kind of stories that we tell. But many stories do have this. I'm always amazed when I travel, and I've been to many, many countries to work on this, how many local stories, how many myths in many cultures follow these kinds of structures. Any other questions? Okay, let's continue. So what are the kinds of struggles, conflicts, troubles that people can have, that characters can have? Again, not a full answer. There's no easy answer to this, but it might help to think about conflicts that are within ourselves. What are the conflicts we all have in our own being that are troublesome? Those conflicts work pretty well in novels, I would say, short stories. Very often in telling a story, you can talk about the individual's conflict with him or herself. But they're very hard to use in some kinds of stories where there's no internal voice that you can hear. So sometimes it's just too internal a conflict for an audience to understand. As I say, when there's a narrator telling you the story, they can say that, the character is conflicted about this, that, or the other. So it really depends on the kind of story as to how internal you can make the conflict. Personal, an individual against others. The idea that, I'm against my neighbor, I'm against another country, I'm against my mother. Think of all the ways that we as individuals have problems with other people. Those are sort of the interpersonal pieces of struggle or conflict or trouble. Very useful, and I think often useful for health communication particularly. Situational stories, an individual at odds with the environment, with the world. You see a lot of stories about environmental problems with people. Those are sort of the situational problems, the hurricane, the earthquake, the typhoon. Those are very visual, visceral problems that we connect to very, very well in the situations where that's the crux of the story. And of course, there's often religious conflict, an individual struggling with God or with their ideas about God or how they're going to continue in the world having that dialogue that so many of us have about God. So those are some of the kinds of stories and conflicts and troubles you can use. I think in health communication, we use the internal one. Whether I should diet or not is often a fight within an individual. We use the individual against others, which could be a reaction against getting the COVID vaccine, for instance. Situational ones, when they're not too big, can be very useful in health communication. I think the spiritual one is a little harder to use in this context, but certainly it's used in some stories sometimes. Anyone got a thought about this or want to ask a question? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Why are stories so powerful? Why is this such a meaningful way to communication? And why do we need to be bothered about it? Why can't we just give people data and assume that they will understand what we're saying? Well, I think I've gone into that a little bit, but let's explore it a little more deeply now. So stories are universal in some ways and very specific in others. So you have this idea of, you know, we've all suffered through these kinds of conflicts that I've just talked about. And so there's a universality to it, but also culture brings such different ideas about it and such useful ideas in how we see ourselves. So I'd like to use as a case study for this Cinderella, which I think will be our next slide. Oh, there are 3,000, there's more than 3,000 Cinderella stories around the world, particularly if you consider all the ones that keep getting generated in different ways. Really interesting example, I think, of this. So there are many variations on the Cinderella myth that appear in folk tales around the world. They've been in cultures for many, many years. It's surprising how common they are. People who study folklore say that it's not because they all get it from each other, that many, many different cultures generate this particular story idea, and then they develop it in their own way. I'll give you a couple examples of that. A mother dies in childbirth, very, very common health issue, of course, and her husband remarries. Their daughter, it's always a girl child, is very kind and innocent. She's persecuted, usually persecuted by her older sisters and or her evil stepmother. Is this beginning to sound familiar? I think so. The father is either neglectful, absent, or dead. I've actually read some stories where he sexually tries to do something to Cinderella, but for the most part, he's just not there. Cinderella must rely on a magic guardian or a mentor for assistance. That sort of goes back to Campbell's idea that you have to have some magic to make things happen. I would argue you don't always need magic. But you need to have some kind of assistance to get your deepest wish. And Cinderella's deepest wish is to marry the prince and live happily ever after, which you probably all remember from the sort of general Disney story. How many people know the Disney story? Cinderella, the 1950 film, or all the adaptations that Walt Disney made. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The first Cinderella actually shows up very early in history in Greece in the late 1st century before Christ. It's called Rhodopis, and it's an ancient tale about an enslaved Greek girl who marries the king of Egypt. So you have the class issue that you often have in the Cinderella story, that the girl or her family is poor, although in the Disney version, of course, she's not so poor. She's, you know, they come from an upper middle class snazzy class, but at the same time, certainly they're not poor. Anyway, in this one, she is poor. This was first recorded by a Greek historian, and it's considered the earliest known variant of Cinderella. I tried to find some more details about what happens to her, but there isn't much that I can find in the folklore literature. Let's go to the next Cinderella. The second Cinderella story is a Chinese story from the 9th century, very early. These stories come a whole lot earlier than we think of when we think of the European versions of this. So, for instance, in this story, see if I can get some of the details of this one. I'm missing a page in my notes. Oh, here. Okay. In the Chinese version, anyone know the Chinese version? It's pretty old. But again, you have 2 sisters and an evil stepmother trying to fight against Cinderella, who is mistreated, lives her life in the ashes in the fireplace, and finally wins in the end. In almost all these stories, the innocent good girl, Cinderella, wins. And she doesn't win necessarily by being very active or doing much, but sometimes she does respond to the evilness that's done to her And in the end, she's rewarded for that. Let's go to the next story of Cinderella. The French version. The French version is actually what Disney used when he wrote the 1950 movie about this. It's by Charles Perrault, and it's particularly interesting, I think, because she's very kind. Again, she's a very good girl, even when she's mistreated by her stepsister. She has two, and her terrible stepmother. She does what they tell her. She tries to be responsive. But then, unfortunately, she suffers, as they all do, from these other women who hurt them in all kinds of ways. But she finds a godmother, a fairy godmother, very similar again to Disney, who makes out of her magic the ability to have a large coach, to have her mice become the coach, the horses for the coach, a beautiful dress. She has more than one beautiful dress in French Cinderella. And of course, the glass slippers, which you may remember. There are many kinds of shoes in all the Cinderella stories. I don't quite know why, but there's a lot of attention to women's feet and who's going to fit into the slipper. The slipper is sometimes gold. It was gold in the Chinese story, or in this story, it's the glass slipper, but there are other ones as well in different stories. But in any case, what I think is most interesting about this one is she's very kind to the stepsisters. When she marries the prince, in spite of their trying to have her not marry the prince, she brings them to the palace with her, and she gives them eligible young men to marry. So everyone is happy at the end of the French version. That's not true of some of the other versions. Okay, let's go on to the next version. After the 17th century. The Grimm version, very different here. In the Grimm version, it's Grimm. See, the good name for the brothers who wrote and rewrote many of the folk tales in Europe. In the Grimm version, after Cinderella marries the prince, she sends birds to take out the eyes of her stepsisters for being so evil to her. She is vengeful. And she punishes them for their bad behavior. That's quite a different step than we've seen in most of the other ones. Interesting. Keep going. And the Disney Cinderella, which I'm assuming is familiar to some of you, I think it's interesting, besides the fact that it sort of follows the French happy story along, although of course there are obstacles and problems, mainly from the stepsisters and the stepmother. One thing that's interesting in this particular illustration, which was pointed out to me by the animators for the original Cinderella, the top of her arm is the same circumference as her waist, which is physiologically absolutely impossible. You can't have a waist as small as the top of your arm, no matter who you are. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any ribs. So again, I think as a model, and of course, this Disney Cinderella became greatly a model in society. You have this massive problem of showing physiology that couldn't consist in women, and yet is considered the epitome of beauty, that her waist be as small as her upper arm. Otherwise, it's pretty much the French story with a couple different magic tricks that the fairy godmother plays. Okay, let's keep going. There's a Malaysian and Indonesian Cinderella, which I found, Bawang Merah Bawang Putih. It's two beautiful daughters of a mother who is attracted and supportive of the beautiful but wicked daughter, not the positive character Cinderella, and tries to get the prince's attention with her beautiful but evil daughter. Ultimately, she does not succeed. Actually, there are many versions of this, and they changed the names of these two girls, these two Cinderella girls, to the point where the good Cinderella wins in the end, and the mother and the bad sister are punished in the end. Anyone know a different version of this? I've read that there are many versions of this Malaysian Indonesian Cinderella, including a movie. Anyone know any more about that?
Yes, there is a different.
Tell us what the ending was.
Actually different only the name, because in Malaysia it's like the good girl is the the Cinderella is the merah, and in Indonesia is different. The putih, the white one is the good Cinderella. They changed the name, but actually the storyline is the same.
Yes, the storyline is amazingly the same, isn't it? With the magic and the magic people and the good and the
fish
bad.
is the fairy god, the mother actually.
The mother's very bad in this one, I think. She's particularly
the
evil.
stepmother. It's the stepmother.
Yes, the stepmother.
The good Cinderella, the mother is the fish. You see the fish on the
yes. She transfers into the fish, and the good Cinderella identifies with her, and then there's a whole penalty part, isn't there, where there's trouble with a snake coming into something. I read a number of different versions of it. I hadn't heard the story, but as usual, there's so many similarities between these stories and these innocent girls, who want to have more success than they do, and who are stopped within their conflicts in their own family. Sort of fascinating when you think about that.
Agree. Different region has a slight changes.
Yes, and one in this story, is it true? One is a scallion and one is garlic.
Yes.
Which is which?
Yeah, the usually like in Malaysia, the good one, the scallion. I think if the Indonesia is the garlic is the good one. Yeah. So they changed the name.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's continue to one final one, a modern Cinderella, a book that I found for children called Interstellar. Oh, here's some other ones. A Gospel Cinderella, one in Hajib, one from Haiti that seems to have at least if the picture is correct, a very old-fashioned version of the Prince and Cinderella, but you sort of get the gist of the same kinds of stories around the world. And then I'll show you for the last Cinderella, the future Cinderella. She's called Interstellar Cinderella. And once upon a planetoid, amid her tools and sprockets, a girl named Cinderella dreamed of fixing fancy rockets. She was a fixer. She made things work. And with a little help from her fairy god robot, sounding familiar, Cinderella is going to go to the ball, but when the prince's ship has mechanical trouble, she will zoom in to rescue and fix it. When this prince asks Cinderella to marry him, she says, "No, I'm too young to marry. I won't marry you, but I'll be glad to help you fix your mechanical problems with your planetary equipment there." So quite a different frame for a modern Cinderella, modeling something other than marrying and living happily ever after with the prince. Okay, let's keep going. Why are stories powerful? Well, they're universal, as I've said. They connect us to our emotions. Keep going. They show us worlds of things and experiences we might never have imagined. Certainly Cinderella is not a story of my life, and I doubt it is of anyone else's. But they certainly show us and expose us to a different way of thinking of things. They help us reframe our beliefs and our problems. We may see ourselves differently because of these stories. They expose us to different points of view and different ways of living, sometimes ridiculous ways of living. I mean, stories have often been, at least in my country and my culture, a way to understand relationships between men and women, different kinds of problems, how to wear makeup or not wear it, how to kiss. We learn all those things from the stories that we see, particularly the visual stories that we see. I believe there's some more here. They can heal us, and I think most important, keep going, they can change our attitudes and our behaviors. And of course, as health communicators, this is the critical one. How do they change our attitudes and behaviors? How might they make us see things differently than we already did? I think keep going, Nina. Next slide. Okay, maybe we don't have any more slides there. But let me just talk about this idea for a minute. If you can get to the next slide, that would be good. because they do more than change our attitudes and behaviors. They really can function to give us a different role model for understanding how we are and what we do. I think that's the critical issue. But now we're going to go actually to a little BBC clip here, which is going to show us something about neuroscience and how it works in connection to story.
There's a Native American proverb that says, "The one who tells the story rules the world." Stories have the potential to be incredibly powerful. They're able to change how we relate to each other, to change prejudice. So the potential for stories to persuade is staggering. I read this really good research paper about these two books, which basically suggested that if you get people to read a couple of chapters of Harry Potter, they'll rate themselves higher than other people in their ability to potentially move something just using the power of their mind. The people who read about the vampires, they'll actually believe that their teeth are slightly longer than other people in the population, just as a result of having read a chapter or two of this book. In terms of psychology, there's a few things that stories actually do to us. We get this sense that we're fully immersed in the world that we're reading about.
Would you like to come on an adventure?
And we start to almost feel as if the things that are happening to them are happening to us.
Reading is not a relaxation. You are building worlds. You are populating those worlds with cities, and those cities you are populating with people. So although television, film, theatre all have their place in the storytelling world, to me that moment of contact with a book, when you read a story and unlock its secrets, nothing quite comes close.
Our research has been on the meaning of individual words. If you read the word jump, for example, you activate those areas that you also activate when you do actually perform the action of jumping. So that would be about here somewhere. The interesting question in this case, of course, is, I mean, if you read about somebody else jumping, why should you activate brain areas related to jumping? The proponents of the theory would say that immersing yourself into a story is based on the mirror neuron system. I am convinced that mirror neurons are part of this process, but it can't be the whole story.
It's been found that when we connect with people who aren't real but are fictional characters, it forms a sort of social surrogate for us. It's almost like they're a real person when they're not. And psychologists sometimes call it forming a parasocial relationship. And what's interesting about that is it kind of makes us feel less lonely, and it can also buffer self-esteem and improve our mood. We know that having a lot of friendships with other people when you're in a couple is a really positive thing for the outcomes of that relationship. But what's really interesting is they don't have to be real people. If you're trying to change people's opinions about controversial topics such as same-sex marriage or immigration, for example, stories have actually been found to be a lot more effective in producing political change. Attitudes towards stigmatised groups could be improved by reading Harry Potter, but only if the person identified with Harry.
Children love stories. They always have a story to tell, whether...
Oh, where'd they go?
If you're trying to change people's opinions about controversial topics such as same-sex marriage or immigration, for example, stories have actually been found to be a lot more effective in producing political change. Attitudes towards stigmatised groups could be improved by reading Harry Potter, but only if the person identified with Harry.
Children love stories. They always have a story to tell, whether it's about the weekend or what happened in the playground. And it's such an important part of understanding the world around them and understanding themselves.
You should definitely turn this off right now and go and pick up a book.
Okay, so a lovely idea of all the different ways that, because of the brain science, we understand how stories work. A very important piece of this to us as a health communications group is the idea of role modeling. When I see someone who looks like me or is of my class or my race or my age or whatever, I'm far more apt to think I could do that thing than if it's somebody else who's older or very different or in any other way. But role modeling is a massive part of why storytelling is so effective. Somehow I can see myself do something that I didn't know I could do. And I begin to think, well, maybe I could do it because she did it and it worked for her. And how many times in culture, particularly these days, do we have people say, I never saw someone who looked like me growing up. I never saw myself. And I don't have any way to frame that because I don't know what I look like in that context. It's a really interesting, I think, and deep issue that's worth a lot of time and attention. Okay, let's go to the important factors of effective stories. And the first one is always, who is the audience? Who am I trying to reach? All audiences are not the same. Let's keep going. But all stories assume some teller and a listener or a reader or an audience. So we have to think about that now. We can't just put out messages based on our beliefs or the health information that we have. We really have to consider that you never reach everybody. Marketing knows this very well as something about I can't reach everyone. Who do I need to reach most? Often in health communication, we talk about the low-hanging fruit, the easiest people to change or get to do something in this context. Sometimes we pick the hardest people to change, and sometimes we've had some success with that, but of course not always. So are you trying to change policymakers, the medical community, your children, your colleagues? How does your audience vary by age, race, religion, ethnicity, education? Again, these are all these role modeling issues that really help you when you think about who is the primary audience for your story. Keep going. What are their fears? What are their worries and concerns? They may not be your worries. I often say to my students, you are not the audience. Even if you are the right age and ethnicity, you have more education, you have more background in these things. If you simply go by the criteria of what you think is important or what the medical community thinks are important, you're missing a large idea that who the audience is matters a lot. We have to do research on who is the audience. I'll speak about that a little later. So do you agree with, are there dissenters to your opinion? Or do most people know nothing about your topic? Those are all questions you need to ask yourself. Are they resistant to your message? Or are they ready to make a change? And in health communication, we call it self-efficacy. It's also really self-confidence. Could they make the change if they want to? You can tell kids to go out and exercise in some kind of a park or something. If there are no parks, they can't do that. So we have to think of all that as we think about who's the audience, what is the message, and what kind of story would embody something that might help our audience to think differently about the topic. Keep going. What do you want them to do? Do you want them to change their behavior? That's the hardest thing, but the simplest thing to measure, e.g. wear a mask, a big one at the moment, of course, change their attitudes so that they would agree with the idea that vaccinations save lives and maybe save their life and their families' lives. or support specific changes in laws and policies. And of course, COVID, as this example, is filled with policies that are changing very rapidly and confusing a lot of people. But what are the specific things that need to be changed to make the COVID vaccination response and other forms of response to this terrible disease work more efficiently? What do we do and what can they do? If they can't get access to shots, let's not send them messages about using vaccines if there's no way that they can get those vaccines. In many countries, of course, as you well know, they can't. So we have to think through all of that before we spend even our limited resources on communication that does not do something that the audience can do. All right, let's continue. So how do you reach them? Now that you've thought about the audience's characteristics, obviously you haven't, but I'm suggesting that that's important for you to do. And you have defined what you're trying to do. How do you tell a story that will move them, inform them, educate them, or make them take action? Here are some hints. These are the things you might want to think about as we get further into this and you think about stories you want to tell. Engage the listeners. You could start with a mystery, a puzzle, surprising finding, a problem that seems to defy solutions. These may lead to what we think of in storytelling as what happens next. I want to know what's going to happen. How is this mystery going to be solved? Make the characters in your story alive and vivid. I've talked about that earlier in this presentation. But if you don't make them alive and exciting, we don't stay interested. If they're simply passive and things happen to them incidentally, I think Cinderella is very often quite passive, but she's done it in a way that makes her a little more active in her passivity, for lack of a better way to put it. Okay, keep going. Provide rich details and engage your listeners' imaginations. You have to give me details in a story. You can't just use generalizations. I need to be able to see what the story looks like. You need to give me details, whether they're about what they ate for dinner or the kind of clothes they wore or the size of their hands or whatever the issues are that make that story compelling. And it's different, of course, for different stories. If you don't engage them in the details of the story, it's too generic. They don't catch on and they don't go with you. Okay, let's keep going. Portray the obstacles, problems, or troubles that your character encounter. Show them, don't tell us that they had a problem. Show us what the problem is and how it looks. Okay, so many times in health communication, that comes from showing somebody with a physical problem or some kind of a health problem. When we see it or we hear it in their words and their point of view, it's far more persuasive than if we're just told they have a disease or something like that. Think more about relatability than likability. I think likability is important, but I think sometimes likability leads to not being very interesting. They just do good things and they're rewarded for them. But I think if you think about this more as an issue of having your protagonist be relatable, someone I see myself in who does have problems, who's not perfect, that's probably a better way to persuade a viewer than making the characters so good or so likable that they're not very interesting. Keep going. Resist stereotyping them. Try to surprise me in some way. A weightlifter who crochets quilts. That will be a memorable character. I've never seen anyone like that. How can you make this character not a stereotype? If you tell a vivid story, inform your audience that the story does not describe just this one unusual person, but it represents thousands. It represents a problem of many, many people. If you can find a way in the story to connect your character to the broader social issues that you're dealing with health, that's a very effective way to do this. And humor helps. We're all less resistant to new ideas when we're laughing. When you laugh, when you feel relaxed and you think something's funny, you're far less apt to come up with intellectual arguments against it. So we often try to find humor in telling these stories as a way to engage people and not make them feel you're a stupid person, you should do what I say. Do we have any more on here? I think we do. Resist. Again, to the issue of arousing fear in your audience. That's a problem. Many health messages are about you'll die if you smoke, things like that. They backfire. First of all, young people don't think they're ever going to die. I can't fully explain that now that I have so much white hair, but they really don't think that anything, and often if you try to tell them that they really could die from something, that makes them want to do it more and try it out. So it can backfire, it can scare them, it can immobilize them. Fear is generally not a good message. There are some specific audiences for which fear may work. Older people who are closer to the end of their lives may be more responsive to something that could help them extend their lives longer. But mostly for young people, we have found in the research that scaring them is not a good idea. And yet so much health communication is about this scolding finger in my face. You should do something. And it doesn't work very well. Okay, keep going. Make sure you have good research data to back you up. Your story has to be accurate, ethical, and realistic. If you make it all up, you're doing a disservice to health communication, obviously, but you're also just going to confuse and upset people and not solve the problems that we all feel are so important in the world that need solving. So you really want to know that your data, the instructions you're giving are accurate and correct. I can't tell you how many times in doing this work, I found out that the messaging is not correct. Sometimes it's no one's fault. They didn't know at that point in time, but sometimes it's just sloppy research or somebody developing a message that really isn't accurate or again, can't be done by the people we're trying to reach. Okay, I think done there. Don't scold or patronize them. I think I've made that point now. Try not to, talking down to people does not work in anywhere in the world that I've been. No one wants to be talked to like that. They don't want to listen. And it's patronizing. I mean, people have reasons for what they do. If you can change their minds or change their attitudes, that's terrific. And story is a wonderful element to help you do that. But just telling them what to do and assuming that they'll do it because it's the healthy thing to do does not work very well. And we sort of know that by now, and yet we still do it. Okay, keep going. I'm going to talk quickly about evaluation. All good messaging needs evaluation, both quantitative and qualitative. The quantitative really helps us with policy. Obviously, many of you are researchers, and I'm sure understand that. The qualitative information helps me more as a storyteller because I get more specific information about why people do what they do. So that formative kinds of research can really help me tell a richer story that's more appropriate to the audience I'm trying to reach. This kind of evaluation involves summative evaluation, what happened at the end of the process, and also process evaluation, where we change things and we change our stories, we change our messaging, we change our positioning based on what we learn from evaluation. The whole field needs better research. For those of you who are interested, it really needs some of deep understanding from all our good research techniques on how to do this better. But we also get outcome kinds of evaluation, obviously, that help us figure out how to continue or do it again. And then impact in the long term. How has this had an impact on my audience? How many more people go to the health center? How many more people get the vaccination? How many more people use condoms? Whatever the issues are, we need to measure the impact of them so that we can do it better, because we don't have all the answers, in case you haven't noticed, in the world, and we have a lot more to learn about this. Okay, I think we're at the end of my, is that right? End of my lecture part, the importance of evaluation, to know whether our messages have been successful, to learn what worked and what backfired and what needs to change, to cover any unintended consequences. Almost all stories, all health messaging can be misinterpreted or can cause people to do things that are not what we had in mind. Really strong, important issues. And then to try to convince donors who are often reluctant to do good evaluations in case the results are not so good. And one piece of advice here would be tell them a story of a program that failed, whose promoters then identified the reasons and finally found the right solutions. So again, you can use storytelling to try to convince donors that even if all the information we get isn't good, everything isn't successful, which of course it never is, this is worth doing because it's a compelling way to communicate with large numbers of people in an efficient and emotionally important way. Have I got any more, or was that it on my little list here? So the moral of my story is numbers numb, but stories are sticky. You can use numbers, you can use data. You have to use it very carefully. We don't remember it. Neuroscience tells us we don't remember it. Stories stay with us and we tell other people. There are so many reasons why the power of story can help you do your work better, whoever your audience is, but the more you think about who your audience is, the better it'll be. Okay, I think we're going on now to small groups, and Basilio is going to help us with this. Basilio, are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Doe. Excellent start. And I wanted to remind everyone that now we will move to our breakout room section, and that will include, once I open up the rooms, participants going into smaller groups. There will be a facilitator in your room, and if you could please listen to the facilitator's instructions. We will use a tool called Google Jamboard, which if you're not familiar with is very easy to use. It just needs your internet connection and you'll have a clickable link upon entering the room that the group facilitator will provide to you. With that, I'm going to move everybody now and you will have 25 minutes in each session of your breakout room. Thank you very much. Opening the rooms now.
Okay. Okay, so is everyone here who's coming, we hope? Okay, did you guys bring a piece of paper? Did everyone bring some paper? We asked you to. Everyone has one or two pieces of paper. If you don't, could you get them now? Or 2 blank pieces of paper would be swell, if you can do that. And I'd like everyone to do the exercise. This is an exercise that should be fun. It is not, the public will not read what you've written unless you want them to. This is really between you and you. It's just a way to think about story that I think will take you in a bit of a different place with it. So, so Basilio, are we fully attended to now? Have we got everybody? Yes?
Yes, we are all good to go.
Okay, so take your piece of paper. The reason why we're going to do this with paper and pencil is because there's a lot of research that creative thinking works better with pencil. I know that you won't like to hear this, with paper and pencil than it does with a computer. That there are things that connect in your brain differently. And for this particular exercise, I think it's helpful for you to do it on paper and pencil. If you don't have that and you want to do it on your computer, you feel strongly about it, do so. But I think you'll find that this is more effective. And again, you don't have to share what you've done with anyone. This is really just for you yourself. Okay, so you're going to get 10 minutes. And what I want you to do is write your autobiography in 10 minutes. Write your autobiography in whatever that means to you. You can describe it in any way you want. If you get frustrated, which we all do, even with only 10 minutes to do this, you really should just play with your pen or pencil, doodle a little, play, hum a song to yourself, do something that doesn't get where you don't get mad at yourself, or you can get mad at me, that's fine. But just for 10 minutes, write your autobiography and then we'll talk about the process. This is not a situation, as I say, that you have to share what you've written. Okay, you got 10 minutes starting now. Okay, let's put the paper down. It's not a test, but put the paper down. And turn it over or find a new piece of paper. I like a blank piece of paper. Turn that one over. You don't have to look at it anymore. And write your autobiography again and don't use anything you used the first time. Don't use any of the information you used the first time. Write your autobiography again. Again, you don't have to share it. What happens when you write it again and you can't use any of the information you used in the first one? You get the same 10 minutes and I'll give you a notice at about 8. One other thought is don't get mad at yourself. If you're frustrated and you don't know what to do, doodle, do something playful, make a sketch, smile. Okay, so what I'd like to do again, no one is required to read what they wrote, but I want to talk about the process. What was the process of this like for you? What was the difference between how you did the first and how you did the second? Again, there's no answer. This isn't a right or wrong, but it's a question of sort of what you get out of this particular experience. So can anyone tell me what the process was like for them?
So when we started the first time, I went about the usual way you write an autobiography about, I was born here and then we went there. And then we moved to this country and then that country. And I didn't really have time to finish it, which was probably a good thing because I managed to stick the remaining information in the second part of the exercise. So it's a very typical sort of a narration of, my life, which isn't very exciting, but, it's been eventful. So when we had to stop, I was only, I think, in my elementary school years. And then when we couldn't, mention the same things again, I had to look at it a different way. And it ended up sort of a reflection on a couple of issues that have sort of defined what my life is up until this moment. But also looking, trying to tell the story of my life with that reflection or through that reflection. For example, just an example, I don't know if there's time. So in the second part of the exercise, I had to kind of, start. So just to give a very brief overview, I'm Sudanese and I was born in Sudan, but my parents have been, all over the place in several countries, and they did their PhDs in New Zealand. And I was a very small child at that time. And then we moved to South America and then to the Gulf and then back to Sudan, etc. So that was the normal way to talk about it. But in the second part, I was thinking about how the fact that my parents chose to do their PhDs in New Zealand because they had a choice between New Zealand and another country. And because at that time, this was in the early 80s, there was no social media or, a gazillion channels on TV. It was just us in that tiny little house in Christchurch. No Arabic speaking people around us, nothing. So it was just, we basically grew up for several years in an all English speaking environment. And I think it was quite a traumatic experience for my parents eventually. But just that fact that was the way we began our lives, it sort of defined the rest of my life, because it is an advantage of having, a second language, especially English, kind of propelled me in different scenarios. And it was a direct reason why I managed to find employment in different situations, how I managed to stand out in different situations, not because I'm special, it's just because the language makes you stand out, especially when the language doesn't really match the way you look, to be blunt. And it helped me through immigration processes, through moving. I've been, had several opportunities to start over in different countries. Because of that, it's a privilege, obviously, even though it comes with other things. So that was, I think it's not the first time I think about this, but it is the first time I look at it this clearly, that I have managed to come this far in my life and in my career, especially with COVID, when everyone, sort of, faced a lot of problems. I managed to remain floating, to put it, in a way, because through this privilege, I had several opportunities that other people didn't. And that's become very frank, especially at this time. So that was a very thought-provoking exercise. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So yes, that's exactly what I want to know is the process, what you got out of this, what it was like for you. What was the difference between the first and second time? They're very different differences, but they're really fascinating in the context of where you go in an exercise like this. Can someone else share with us as well? Who else volunteers? Oh, Aurea, that'd be fine.
I'd be happy to share quick. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Be happy to share as well. It's interesting. The first thing that I went to when you first talked about the exercise, is I guess I thought about self-identity. What did I want to talk about that was important to me? And so for the very first one that I wrote, I talked about my diagnosis of diabetes as a child because it was such an important turning point of my life. And I also figured it would be a really good hook to bring people in if they were actually reading a book about my life. And when you said to write the second one using no words from the first, I was like, no, but diabetes is my whole life. And it took me, I got a little bit frustrated. I was like, who am I? What other parts of myself can I talk about? And that was a bit of a, I suppose a self-realization. I'm so many parts, I have so many cool parts to me, and yet I gravitate towards the health part because it has been such an important part of my identity, both personally and professionally for a while. But then on the second one, I hopped over to my mixed race background. So I have a mom who's a Chinese immigrant and then a dad who grew up here in Canada. And I wanted to talk about the fact that I grew up in kind of like a household that had cultural conflict in it, just based on priorities and values. And that's where I went for my second one. I described my mom and my dad and how I'm a mixture of both, but also neither of them. And so I went in kind of two completely different directions. And I didn't really truly talk about my life as a whole, to be honest. I talked about one thing about myself, which was my diagnosis journey, and then another part of myself, which was my cultural identity.
Great, thank you. Who else can go? Please.
I believe Khairul was next.
Okay.
Hi, thank you, Doe. Yeah, this is good exercise because I think I'm the kind of person that always think in time at the moment. It's like I really like thinking about my past and maybe moving forward. So it's quite like I don't know what to write in the first place because I never think about it. But the first part, the first exercise, at first I was talking about like trying to get my personality, and then like coming back to like somewhat like resume type thing, like working experience, and also and then the next paragraph I think I might continue with my personality, but then I came back again into what I'm doing currently. So it's not really then when you said the second time you said you have to ignore the first thing that I wrote, I was like, what should I talk about? Then I think I just like I went through details. I think it takes a lot of time of thinking of what details I need to think about. Then I talk about the place that I go, the details of it, why. There is more on the second part, is more on the why I like about this place, why I like about what my favorite hobbies, what my favorite subjects. And yeah, I think this is good. I never think about writing about myself, and I think it's good for because I never think about like I think I agree with Oria. We never thought about, we think that we know about ourselves more, but then I think when we try to explain, we doesn't know what to talk about.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, if anyone wants to share something of what they've written, that's fine. We have time, and I think this is a fascinating exercise. And so if you feel comfortable sharing something, that's fine. But again, no obligation. Who wants to go next? Uday? Are you next? Great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doe. And like I have like similar story that of the Arya and Dream, but like just in the different conceptual framework. And to be like, I'm basically, first of all, let me tell about myself. I'm originally from Nepal, and I represent one of the marginalized community in Nepal. And while writing this story, first of all, I try to connect myself to my cultural identity and language in context to Nepal. And then also I tried to connect, like at that time in my childhood, how was my family suffering in Nepal, and how they involve us in the sorts of educational opportunities, and how I was supported from the different communities in Nepal, and how about my explaining about my journey. And in the first paragraph, first page, I talk about that. Who am I? How I was, and how I got into the educational sector in the very beginning. because of the, there was not like kind of scholarships and other, and at that time I took one course that is microbiology at that time, though I was not interested, but we don't have like financial support, but I jumped into that subject. And later on, like after that, my journey began. Someone from the US is supported my educational journey. And then I took my master's of public health in India. And then after that, like, again, I started working, and then I ended up right now, I completed my PhD from Australia. So that is all about my journey. And the second paragraph that you gave us the opportunity to write, that was very difficult for me. And then like I started thinking in the different perspective. Okay, that was my life journey. So what could be my achievement and other stops in this 5 to 6 years? Then I started looking at myself and my profile. Then I felt like, oh, I achieved a lot. Because after that, like from 2015 to 2021, I can see like at that time, I tried to point out like the list of the publications that I had, and like list of the invitations from the reputed journals that I got in these 5 years. And also like from the different awards from that I got from WHO or from the national government or from the Australian government, and also the media coverage of my work. I tried to capture that. That was one of the difficult, though lots of things was there in the profile, but while summarizing those things. And then lastly, my last paragraph of mine in the second was that I got this much, but what I contributed to the community, what I contributed to the people whom I choose to serve, in what way? Is it just by the evidence, or I took it like in the simple, like the storytelling? Then I connect myself, like the most powerful thing that I used in my life is that still till now, if you see, like always in all the academic papers, I try to present some of the, like diagrams and others representing the community. So I try to summarize the things, like, I guess, in my career, the most important thing that I learned is about creating the impact through the stories in the policy, practice, and in the learning environment in Australia or wherever in the world. This is what I tried to summarize. The second was quite tough as compared to the first one.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Who else would like to go? I hope you'll all go. We have time, and I'm very interested. So please share. Who's next?
George.
I think I can go. For me, I think the first one I really struggled, and I think part of that is a cultural issue, because in Ghana, you hardly talk about yourself. So I think I spent about 2 to 3 minutes just trying to figure out what the hell, excuse my language, I was going to write. But I ended up, I think, just like Karu, just talking about my, date of birth, the siblings that I had, or the number of siblings, and then trying to trace my own career trajectory, linking that with the careers of my parents. Both are in the health sector, and I find myself in, global health. So indirectly, my career choices are linked to what my parents' career choices, which also tell the story of most Africans or Ghanaians. Most children career choices are in some form determined by the choices their parents make for them. I think with the second, then I think I had to think more carefully in terms of, okay, where was I born? So I was more focusing on the place where I was born. So Kumasi, the cultural setting, the people, and how that had influenced one, my faith, and two, how I am perceived within my own community. So Ghana, even though we consider ourselves first as Ghanaians, there are different ethnic groups, and growing up in in a different part of Ghana and speaking that language and not being able to speak my own ethnic language, I've often been described as the lost kid, you know, when I visit grandparents or relatives. So trying to link, you know, the place of my birth and how that has shaped who I am and my relationship with my extended family. Yeah.
Okay, great. Very different, aren't they? They're quite different in so many ways. Think about also the similarities in the process. Okay, who else wants to go? Oh, come on, everyone, don't be shy. It's only the process. You don't have to share what you wrote, but we've had such wonderful presentations. Who else? Basilio, help me out here.
Christine, what do you think? I was wondering about your story because we haven't heard from you.
Okay, so the first part, I also did struggle. Like George said, I also like didn't know what to write about. So in the first part, I talked about my childhood and the defining moments in my childhood, especially like at one point I had to change schools and what that meant for me and how the changing of that was just the beginning of a whole different life for me. And then in the second part, it's I think at some point I actually felt like I was journaling because I was looking for how to introduce myself, like who am I right now, like if somebody was to ask me, like I have an opportunity like with you now right now to introduce myself. So I ended up looking at the things that interest me, what I am passionate about, and just thinking around that, like things that that I'm really passionate about and what I really want to do, or rather where I am now in terms of my career and what that means for me. So it was very different, like looking like now the way I moved from my childhood to now looking at my life right now, and like yeah, how I would want you to know me as.
Great, wonderful. Who's next? Okay, Jerome.
Hi, hello. I really like this exercise. It was such a mind-blowing thing. So, so the first part, I mean, I do have some similar to George, Christine, to some of you. In the first part, it was basically the beginning is just like the normal introduction of like it's like a resume, like, oh, what are your highlights, your education background, what I have achieved so far. Then basically but after that, then it's just bits and pieces of like, here, I want to put this, I want to put that, and it's like a mess for my first part. But then when I go to the second part, I was like, what am I supposed to write? And then it was a different approach when I wrote it. It was somewhat of my character and personality where I wrote it. It's like, who am I? What do I like? What do I want to share? So basically when I wrote it, it's like, it's so different from the first one. The first one is like your achievements. The second one is like, what I felt it like more your struggles, your flaws. And then I wrote things that shaped me more as compared to the first one. So that was my take of this exercise. So
great.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Who are we missing here? Chachitra, are you here? Chachitra Diani? I guess not. And Mesa? Not with us. And we have UNIIGH there. Who's that?
That's me, actually. I'm just doing as a participant.
Good. And can you tell us what your process was?
I think it was really similar to what others had, which is that I thought chronologically about my life and sort of got lost in the 10 minutes explaining that. And in fact, I realized that it was kind of boring and I was kind of getting lost towards the end where I thought, hey, why do I keep talking about this? Like, I don't think people really care as much. It's not so exciting. So when we flipped the page, the thing that I just wanted to, I got frustrated and I thought, let me just write about what I want in my life. And I ended up writing that I'm a person. I didn't mention geography. I didn't mention identity, any of that. Who cares about my mother and my father and my brother? And one day I want to find happiness with a partner, with a family of my own. But be comfortable. You know, I want these people to be provided for. And then there was a layer on top of that that I discovered, which is I want my community to be better for all of its members too. And I also realized that I want to leave my community, you know, not to be morbid or maybe just moving or, yeah, if my life ends, whatever, but leave my community a better place for all those people. And that's what I'd consider a lived life. And that's really all I wrote in the end.
Wonderful. They really are so touching, what you've all written here. Are you holding your hand up, Karul? Or is that just something else? Some little. Let's talk about what were your frustrations in the process and how did you deal with it? Every one of you sort of said, I had a difficult moment or I got frustrated. What did you do when that happened? Just anyone. Did anyone doodle? Do you doodle to sort of?
I wrote here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I think, like I mentioned just now,
Yes.
I never think in a structured way or how am I supposed to present myself. So, like in my essay, at first paragraph, I was talking about like I'm a urban city dweller, for example. Then I'm talking about more on the perspective like qualitative thing, and then suddenly I changed, hey, this is not right, so it's not autobiography, so I'm changing to like resume that like I'm working as something. So I think the most frustrating part of me is like I think this is what everyone else I think is going, it's like learning about yourself. I think it's like thinking about what you have done and everything. I think that's how we yeah, even on the second part I have to look back a bit, sorry, just to think
okay.
To think like what else I got about myself, because you know sometimes you need to think hard. Not to be like redundant doing it, right? So yeah, that's another frustrating thing. And also how to write it, you know, how to put I have everything in my mind, but I don't know how to portray it. I mean, how to convey it in writing. That's another frustrating thing. Yeah.
Well, it's hard. This is not an easy exercise, but I'm hoping you all found it a stimulating exercise for yourselves, for this conversation that so many of you had with yourselves in this process. Anyone else want to talk about how they dealt when they got mad at themselves? Did you get mad at me? Did you get mad at sitting there? What happened to you when you got frustrated? No one got frustrated? A number of you said you did. I'm sure you did.
Well, for me, I think I had to go back to a nursery rhyme.
What was that? What was the rhyme?
You know, in nursery school, they tell me about yourself, and then you pledge. So
yes.
Myself, my name is George. I think I come from here. You know, I have this number of brethren. So I mean, that was a thought that came to me, and I did that for some few seconds, and I'm like, okay, I think I have a structure. So talk about, you know, the number of siblings that you have, where you were born, and you know, your parents, and that is what kind of got me started.
Good, great. It's so all I'm trying to do, obviously, here is get you a little more self-aware of how you think and how you use these processes as creative people and as people in general. But there is so much to all of us. We're all so much deeper than, you know, you start this and so many of us start with, you know, what I call the cocktail party discussion or the resume discussion of who I am. Here's where I was born. Here were my siblings. Here's the place, you know, and when that's all taken away from you, you have to go, as you've all sort of described yourselves, in different places. You have to use this somehow differently. And you described many, many different ways that you've all sort of went in the second part when you were sort of forced out of the part you started in. And, you know, I think that's a really interesting process. Anyone else deal with their frustration? Did anyone doodle? Do you ever try doodling or just sort of drawing patterns on a piece of paper or something? I think it's easier than with a computer. Did anyone find just the work of doing this on paper different or difficult or more frustrating than doing it on a computer? What was your experience of that? Was it better, worse, or just different?
Oria seems to have an idea.
Great.
Is that right?
Yes, I do have an idea. It's going back one question ago, but I was going to say when I got frustrated, I tend to word vomit. My issue is never that I don't have stuff to say. I think it's rather that I have a lot to say and it comes out rather chaotically or ungracefully. And so with the second one, before I had decided what I was going to write about, I just kind of like word vomited onto the page for a couple sentences. And then I found a groove and I kept writing and I went back and I crossed out a couple sentences where I didn't like what I was writing about. But I've found that like the word, I don't like the word vomit, but the word vomit method has been really helpful in essay writing or in paper writing in the past. And I kind of brought that coping mechanism over to this activity and it worked pretty well for me. And I thought I'd share that.
No, that's great. And it's a great share. And again, it's not that anything's right for everybody. It isn't. But the more you know about what triggers you, what you can use when you're frustrated or what you can't use when you're frustrated, the better you're capable, I think, of telling your stories and of telling other stories. So, you know, I mean, that's the idea of this. Do you extract anything else out of this exercise that you would want to share with the group? Is there anything else that this brought up or that when you hear other people talk about it, you realize something? No, nobody?
I have a comment. I think that a lot of times when people ask us to tell our story, our reflexive reaction is to think, what does this person want to know? And then you want to come up with something to tell them that they want to know. But that has nothing to do with what you actually really want to say sometimes. Because you don't think anyone cares about what you want out of life. You don't think anyone cares about what is important to you. You immediately wonder, what's this person after and what can I provide that's important to them? Once you strip that away from someone, you realize, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to just say what I want to say and what I care about.
Well, and in this case, you are the audience. You know, no one else has to hear what you said. It's really a conversation, a dialogue you had with yourself. And if it's stimulating and if it helps you think, I think, more deeply, which is certainly part of the assignment, whatever that means to you, however it manifests to you, then that's a very useful technique to have as you think about storytelling, that, you know, maybe you need to get below the surface level, however that manifests in your own storytelling, whether it's vomiting, I love vomiting, that's sort of perfect, you know, or going into a very specific direction or saying, I don't care what the audience think, I'm going to do what I want to do here, this is just for me, or just the feelings that George and others of you acknowledged that you don't usually think about yourself this way and that it's worthwhile and stimulating to you to do so. So I hope you'll take that, extract that from this exercise. Anything else anyone wants to say about the process or about the commonality between you all or the uncommonality? Because I saw both. I have a couple little notes. Sometimes I think the second one was more emotional. It was deeper. It often was more visual. You sort of went to a more visual place in thinking about yourself. Sometimes it's a more visceral place, a more emotionally connecting place that you went. And I see some people nodding about that. You know, again, I think when you're sort of forced to take away the things that, you know, you generally use to identify and hold yourself up, some wonderful creative things happen. And that, of course, is part of the process here. Often, I think the second one is more story-based and less sort of chronological. Again, not always, and there's no good answer for this. It's not that you needed to do it one way or another, but often you get to when you strip away some of those bones, you get to something that's more story-based and more compelling. And, you know, sometimes the first one is more of a list, as we've talked about lists and data. And the second one is more of a story. It's more emotionally connecting to you. It's more intimate, it's deeper, and it's probably going to be more interesting to an audience, even though, as Basilio says, in this particular assignment, it didn't have to be particularly connected to an audience. It really was you were the audience. But I'm hoping you got that out of it and it helps you journal more. Christine mentioned it's sort of kind of a journal concept here. I think that's useful and I encourage you to continue to do that. But it's also, as I say, I think a wonderful tool for your storytelling to realize that, you know, the first answer may not be enough. It may not be connected enough. It may not be emotional enough. You know, I mean, that chronological story we all tell, generally we've told it 100 times and it's not very emotionally connecting to us. But once you can't use that, you have to find another way to express yourself. And I think for all of you, you found a way that was interesting to you. And that, I hope, is something you'll take out of this workshop. So I'm delighted with the way it worked. And I hope that you'll take it with you wherever you go and whatever you do. But it certainly will help you, I think, as you think about what stories to tell and how to tell them. So we're sort of close to the end of this. I wanted to give you there's a homework assignment, which I hope you'll all do. Nina, you want to put up the homework assignment for us? Here she comes. So here's the homework assignment. It's due for the next workshop. I hope you'll all come. We didn't have quite as many people as we wanted, but you guys have been terrific. So I certainly hope you'll stay with us. Select a photo. I assume everyone can find some photo from your own work or from wherever you can find one that you like, that emotionally helps you to connect. So it could be a photo of you, your family. It could be a photo of something that's happened in the world that you connect to, but something that means something to you, not something that's not just pretty in your terms, but has some emotional significance. Doesn't matter to me what it is. It doesn't have to be a family picture. It can be something beautiful or something that takes you to a different place or reminds you of something else. And it also can be something to do with health and the medical systems that you're all working in one way or another. And the assignment is to write a short story about it based on what we've talked about in this class. So it can be based in reality, but you can adopt it from what you've learned about better creative storytelling. Maybe start with, you know, somebody who has a problem and how do they deal with that and what are the obstacles? Making sure that the point is, what are the problems and not necessarily just what is the solution. If you remember the diagrams of story, they almost all involve a very deep understanding of the obstacles that can't make it hard for us to get to where we want to go. So in any case, you can do that. Make sure that it gives accurate health or appropriate messages. So this is not for an audience of you, although you start with it being connected to you. It really is to an audience. It's worthwhile to think about, as this text says, remember to think about who the audience is and write that down. Write it at the top of what you're writing, because we'll ask you about it when we see you on Thursday, your time, or wherever you are, but the next time. So think about who the audience is. You can't do much research in this homework assignment, but in real life you can. You can do more research, and all of you can pick a subject that you do know about so that your information can be something that you feel is quite accurate and appropriate for the audience you want to reach. Remember to think about who the audience is, what you want them to change or understand. Do you want them to change their attitudes, to change their behaviors, or their practice in some way? And then in the next class, bring your photo. I'd like to see your photo. We would all like to see your photo and the written paper, and be ready to read and discuss this in your small group. And if we're a small enough group, we may do it all together. Basilio and I will have to figure that one out. But make it just one page, a short story, 300 words, something that you could share with us that deals with something that matters to you. And if more has come up that matters to you through this last assignment, that's terrific. You're welcome to pick anything of that sort, but it, I think, will be most useful to you if it does have something to do with a health issue that you're dealing with. Not yourself, but in terms of your work and your outreach. Is that clear to everyone? Anyone have any questions about the assignment? Take it any way you want, but please do it. It won't work as well if you don't do it. And I really enjoyed your responses to this. So I'm hoping that you'll all continue to actively participate, and we'll see if we can catch some people that I think may have come and may have left at some point earlier. But You know, it really is for you, and with any luck, if you feel satisfied or stimulated by this, I hope you'll stick with us. And thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure to be with you and to learn about you. And I hope we'll continue in a couple of days.